The first time Mark Reynolds lost consciousness, he was standing in the middle of a half-finished office complex in Dallas, the August sun beating down on his hard hat. One moment he was arguing with a concrete contractor about improperly mixed footings. The next his vision tunneled to black and he was on his knees, tasting blood where he'd bitten his tongue. His crew gathered around him, their faces a blur of concern. "You okay, boss?" His foreman, Carlos, helped him up, brushing gravel from his jeans. "You just went down like a felled tree." Mark waved him off, the metallic taste in his mouth mixing with the ever-present dust of the construction site. "Too much sun," he muttered, though the digital readout on the job trailer showed only 92 degrees, downright mild for a Texas summer. He chalked it up to dehydration, skipped lunch, and kept working. But deep down, something felt off. It wasn't just the blackout. It was the way his hands trembled slightly when he reached for his water bottle, the momentary fuzziness in his thoughts when he tried to remember what section of rebar they'd poured that morning. Then the episodes kept coming. There was the time in Home Depot when he suddenly found himself on the floor of the plumbing aisle with no memory of falling, a concerned elderly couple hovering over him, offering bottled water and awkward comfort. The morning he came to in his truck at a green light, horns blaring behind him, his foot still on the brake. The afternoon meeting when his project manager's face suddenly melted into incomprehensible shapes before everything went black again. His doctor ran basic blood tests and diagnosed anemia. The urgent care physician blamed stress and handed him samples of sleeping pills. A neurologist ordered an EEG that showed some unusual activity, but nothing definitive. An MRI was suggested, but insurance delays meant waiting months. All the while, the real culprit thrived, sending out tendrils through the delicate folds of his brain like ivy creeping up a brick wall. He began keeping a journal, not out of paranoia, but necessity. Times, dates, triggers, foods, medications, patterns, but the only thing the entries showed was unpredictability. The blackouts came with no warning, no specific stressor, no pattern. The breaking point came on an unremarkable Tuesday morning. Mark's wife, Sarah, found him slumped at the kitchen table, his face resting in a puddle of lukewarm coffee. At first, she thought he'd fallen asleep mid-sip. They'd fought about money the night before and he'd barely slept. Then she noticed the rhythmic twitching of his fingers against the formica, the way his left eyelid fluttered while the right remained eerily still. "Mark?" she said, her voice already trembling. She shook his shoulder. "Mark!" When the paramedics arrived 12 minutes later, his oxygen levels had dropped dangerously low. In the ambulance, his seizures grew so violent they had to strap him down. By the time they wheeled him into Baylor University Medical Center, the ER team was preparing to intubate. The MRI revealed the nightmare in stark black and white. Dozens of cystic lesions dotted Mark's brain like bubbles rising in champagne. Some were small and smooth as marbles. Others had jagged edges that pressed ominously against critical structures. The largest, nearly the size of a grape, sat squarely in his parietal lobe, explaining why he'd been inexplicably dropping tools from his left hand for weeks. "Neurocystic Dr. Ahmed said, tapping the largest cyst on the lightbox. The clinical term felt absurdly inadequate for the alien shapes marring the scan. "Tapeworm larvae in the brain." At first, Mark thought it was a joke. Tapeworms? In his brain? But the pieces fell together with sickening clarity. That taco stand he frequented near the job site last summer, the one where the pork always seemed suspiciously pink in the middle. The way he'd joked the carnitas were still oinking. The eggs had hatched in his intestines, the microscopic larvae slipping into his bloodstream and migrating upward until they found the perfect breeding ground, the warm, nutrient-rich environment of his brain. Treatment was its own special hell. The anti-parasitic medication caused the cysts to swell before they died, triggering waves of debilitating headaches, nausea, and memory lapses. For 3 days, Mark drifted in and out of consciousness, his dreams populated by squirming shadows. Once he woke screaming that he could feel them moving, his fingers clawing at his scalp until nurses restrained him. Steroids helped manage the inflammation, but they came with their own price: mood swings, insomnia, brittle bones. He lost 15 pounds in a month. Sarah barely left his side, except when she stepped out to sob in the hallway. When the worst passed, the damage remained. The construction foreman who once balanced million-dollar budgets in his head now struggled to calculate a 20% tip. The man who could recite every Super Bowl score from memory sometimes forgot his home address mid-sentence. His left hand developed tremors so persistent he could no longer hold a coffee mug, let alone a hammer. Eventually, he sold his truck. Sarah took over the bills. Mark applied for disability. Now Mark keeps his brain scans on his phone. When coworkers joke about eating questionable street food or skipping hand washing, he shows them the ghostly images of those cysts. Not for sympathy, not for shock value, but because the most terrifying monsters aren't in horror movies. They're microscopic, they're patient, and sometimes they're already inside you, just waiting to wake up. The really chilling part? According to the CDC, thousands of Americans likely have neurocysticercosis right now without knowing it. The symptoms often mimic more common conditions: migraines, epilepsy, even dementia. By the time doctors discover the truth, the damage is usually permanent. Mark's case made the New England Journal of Medicine, but he takes no pride in that. Every morning when he pops his anti-seizure meds, every time he fails to remember a coworker's name, every time his body betrays him, he's reminded of the invisible enemy that stole pieces of his life. He's not angry, not exactly, just haunted. Sometimes he dreams of the pork taco again, warm, spiced, dripping with fat, and wakes with a scream stuck in his throat. The parasite is gone, but the fear lingers. And the scariest question of all, how many others are walking around with the same ticking time bombs in their heads? How many more Mark Reynoldses are out there just one seizure away from discovering their own private horror story? That question keeps him up at night. That and the nightmares. Always the nightmares.